We're moving on to day 11 today, everyone. And this is going to be one of the more fun ones for me, for sure, because we get to tackle Kant. I think I made some remark last time that we're also going to look at Hegel today. That's not true. Hegel's in a later portion, so we'll look forward to that next time. But for now, let's start things off by talking about this thing called the Enlightenment. You heard me talk about the Enlightenment or mention the Enlightenment already earlier, right? When we discussed Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza and so forth. I mentioned only the rationalists and Hume and so forth. The Enlightenment was already underway at this point. So Gaarder going into this chapter of the Enlightenment is really just sort of already embellishing and talking a little bit more at length about something we've already been experiencing and seeing up to this point. I want to show a quick couple of paintings that really help highlight again the conditions, the cultural and historical conditions for this time period, though, given that Gaarder has already opened the topic. And then we're going to spend hopefully most of this time talking about Kant and why this is such a significant contribution to philosophy. That is, why do some philosophers even, and I disagree with them, but why would some people go so far as to say that Kant, maybe philosophy didn't even truly exist in its current form before Kant, or maybe at all before Kant? But back to the Enlightenment for a second. Here we have a painting by Jacques-Louis David. If that sounds familiar, it's because he also painted that really famous death scene of Socrates that we saw a long time back. His style is very easy to pick out, I think. This is called the Oath of Horatii, or Horatii, or however you want to pronounce that. What's going on here? So this painting is showing a scene that has to do, is about this Roman legend happening sometime around the 7th century. And there are a bunch of cities, they're at war, and there's this ideal of patriotism and doing the right thing. And part of that patriotism, of course, is sacrificing yourself for your city / police or country. So they decide, instead of go out into this full-on war that involves armies and all these other things, why not do something that is just as heroic but involves fewer casualties, and send some elite representatives. To some extent, I kind of feel like we should do this too. Sports feels like this is done, the Olympics and such. These elite representatives who are masterfully skilled at what they do, in this case war, and they're going to represent that police, and they're going to fight each other. The representatives are going to fight each other instead of armies made up of drafts of people fighting each other. And of course, whoever is victorious in that is going to be representing that city or country, so that is going to be the victorious police. Now, what is the deal with this painting? Why is it? This is of Rome. What does this have to do with the Enlightenment? Part of what the Enlightenment encouraged was this reinvigoration of some of these moral values: patriotism, honor, courage, and so forth. And we see that in paintings like this made by people of this time period, like Jacques-Louis David. And we get a sense, therefore, of what it is that people were aspiring to not just represent in art, but represent in their own lives. In other words, as Gaarder mentioned, this is a period of cultural optimism. And to understand cultural optimism, let's first look at cultural pessimism. The belief that a culture, or even humanity itself, is in a process of irreversible decline, says Wikipedia. I will not continue to always cite from Wikipedia, but I thought they had a particularly good definition here. There's this phrase, maybe you've heard before: everything is going to hell in a handbasket. I've heard it more times than I'd like to admit. And that is not just something that maybe seniors, older people in our society say, but it is something, it seems, that you kind of grow into over time. Perhaps you dislike change. Many of us do. As we get older, it's harder and harder to conform to new changes, and so it would feel like as each generation moves on, each of those generations maybe looks at the current generation and goes, oh man, this is a tragedy compared to what was before, even though none of us would actually probably vote to go back into time and re-experience generations before us, because they didn't have things like smartphones and toilets and things like that, cars. So we wouldn't want to do that, but we still obviously think that things are in decline. Now, whether you have a justified reason for that or not, that is a particular approach to the world. It is a particular way of viewing the world, is that everything's in decline. Now, the Enlightenment period is not this, right? It's the opposite of this. It's what we would call cultural optimism. And as Gaarder picked out, it has to do with these notions of creativity and progress as opposed to decline. That is that not just one's own culture, of course, not just one's own time hints at a sense of progress, but that in general, culture and everything, time periods in history, each in their own way were contributing to this sense of creativity and progress. So even if you go back to these, I've mentioned before how devastating in some senses the Roman times were. However, remember too that they were the ones who built roads and aqueducts. They ended up helping with, in a way, unifying swaths of lands that were otherwise sometimes in bitter rivalry with each other. And now they're still allowed to worship their own gods, but they, of course, have to reserve the ultimate spot in their hierarchy for the Caesar or some emperor. So there are bads and goods, but ultimately it's kind of, which do you think? Would you have preferred society not had the Roman period, or that it did? Of course, we can always hypothesize that it could have taken place but been handled differently, but we could say that of any time period. We could say any time period that we see having all these devastating effects could have been done differently as kind of a hindsight bias, and maybe it could have mostly, if not purely, been a creative and progressive sense, beneficial, I should say, beneficial to us in every way, not just the roads and the aqueducts, but maybe the way of policing and the way of helping others conform to a central sense of value. The United States, again, I think is a very good example of this, where at least up to the present, and hopefully moving into the future too, we don't bind people together by a dictatorship. We bind people together by sets of values, and your citizenship here is, in a way, an expression of those values. All right, here's another really telling painting, again, under this same sense of expression of ideals that represent creativity and progress. Now, you see there's darkness here. It's a very dark scene. They're indoors, and we can see an old man in the middle of the painting is dying. And what I believe, what seems clear, at least also in this painting, though, that Jean-Baptiste Grutze, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, actually, but part of what Grutze is, I believe, demonstrating here, and you can see it sort of in the different names this painting has taken on: filial piety, the paralytic and his family, or the benefits of a good education. What do all of these symbolize? They indicate that the man, yes, is dying, and in a way this is a tragic, sad scene, but do you see even those who are around him and mourning and paying attention to him? One of the young ladies here is, look, she seems to almost be reading him a story, and this one is feeding him food, and this one has put on a blanket, donned on him a blanket. There is a sense that of true family here, a familial or filial sense of respect and observance of this old man, the patriarch of the house, perhaps. And that's why would they call this the benefits of a good education? Because look at their moral vibrance in being around them and taking care of him and being there for each other. You see this man, we assume maybe they're perhaps their brother and sister. They could be husband and wife, who knows? But they're even leaning into each other and holding this period of mourning together. It's a beautiful scene, actually. Despite the darkness, despite the tragedy of this death, we see something beautiful shining forth in this. It's the morality of these people. It's the morality that comes as the result of what we could call a good education. This isn't the education of make sure you understand the elements in your periodic table, or make sure that you have your multiplication tables, for that matter, also memorized, or your squares, your perfect squares, and so forth. This is an education that embraces the thing that we often think is the least scientific at times, the moral, the ethical. That this is something that we don't teach in schools very frequently is very interesting, up to a point. Then you might realize that actually we kind of do sometimes, and maybe there'll be more time to go into that another day. But morality does seep into our schools, and the way that we teach ethics is often more underhanded than this, than the way that they embraced this in the Enlightenment. And we'll see how this plays in Kant's work. Another great painting that will move us now a little bit away from just the ethical implications of this Enlightenment and tell us a little bit more about what is the relationship with God now, which is important. This is still a primarily Christian society, although atheism is also on the rise and other religions are being observed. People are learning more and more about Buddhism and Taoism and other things too, Hinduism perhaps. And in the altarpiece of John the Evangelist, a little bit earlier, as you can see, than the other two paintings by Hans Bergmeyer the Elder, we have actually this three-piece painting, as you can see here. Looks like this. In each of these three panels, we have a very important representative of Christianity. We have a saint on either side. You can see them in their saintly attire, St. Elmo and St. Martin. And then in the middle, we have an evangelist named John the Evangelist, presumed to be possibly the writer of the book of Revelations in the Bible, which if you haven't read that, go check that out, or at least read about that, know what the Revelations are, and features a lot in people's thinking both these days and earlier. Let's go back to that painting for a second. What do you notice is going on with the evangelist? He seems to be looking up to the heavens, and whether you perceive that to be God, it does appear almost as if there's a crown on the little man's head up there in the clouds. So either it's God, or maybe it's Jesus / God, or just Jesus, or maybe it's an angel. It almost doesn't matter. Let's just call it divine influence, or what we might also call revelation. And up to this point, this has been the primary way that people have considered their relationship with God. Whatever God you want to pose that as, let's stick with the Christian God for now. The way that you come to know that God is by way of revelation. God appears to you and descends upon you and influences you and so forth. And if you're lucky enough to get that, this was part of what Martin Luther was not so sure about. You do all these rituals, you go to church, you do your repentances, you etc., etc. You do all these things, and you will be supposedly at some point, hopefully, again, due to providence, not simply by your doing the acts, it's not a reward, but it's like the only state in which you're able to receive this revelation, is this influence, this direct, as it were, connection with God. And in this painting, Copernicus, the astronomer Copernicus, conversation with God. Wait a minute. Conversation with God. Now, it's very interesting to go back and forth between these two paintings. I'm going to do that real quick. I want you to look carefully. What's going on? So here, looking up to the skies, we see God's direct interaction with this man here with the evangelist. And it is revelation. But then we have this version with Copernicus. Copernicus is also looking to the heavens, but where's God in this? Well, it's not God in a direct interaction in the way of revelation. He's looking to the stars from his tower, and here we can see Matejko, I think Jan Matejko is, I believe, how that will be pronounced. 1872 is when this was made, so we've fast-forwarded quite a bit. He has included Copernicus's sun and the system, the new and improved system that is non-Ptolemaic, where the sun is now in the center and the earth revolves around it. And he's looking to the stars, and we can say, oh, well, he's simply, looking and confirming and studying the stars as a way of doing science. But that's a little bit too modern day thinking, in my opinion. This is called a conversation with God. Here we have the beginnings of what we call deism or deism. I'll probably call it deism because we say theism versus deism a lot of the time. So the position that reason and observation, not revelation, are sufficient for claiming the existence of a God or creator. And not simply just making an existence claim for God, but actually having a relationship, in a sense, knowing God in some form, in some way. Again, God doesn't descend from the heavens and show itself to us. We rather partake in our reality and by the way of reason, come across God, as it were, discover God for ourselves. That's what Copernicus is doing. That's what Kant, in a sense, will kind of have a sense of doing, although it's a little different too. He doesn't actually think that you can, by way of reason, encounter God. But more on that in a second. Many of these Galileo, many of these are these famous thinkers that we would think of as, oh, great, closer to modern scientists, are also still very steeped in the idea that a relationship with God is possible, and that whether or not you have a proof of the existence of God, that you can at least claim for yourself and hope others will believe you as well, the existence of God, because you come across him, and at this time it was definitely him, by way of reason. This divine order. We'll see this time and again, not in this particular course, but as you study history, you come across this time and again where people say, they look at an eyeball and they say, oh my gosh, how could anything but a great, incredible divine source, a designer, right? A creation-based or creationist designer has made the eyeball clearly. I mean, it is truly complicated. I've visited a dentist before who I loved visiting because he would teach me so much about my teeth. He told me that his own commitment to the existence, to the claim of an existence of God, was because he could not imagine, knowing as much as he did about teeth, that teeth could possibly have come about by any other means than divine creation. To imagine, there are still people today who kind of aspire, or if not aspire, who still align with this sort of deist notion that, as it were, there's evidence for God, and when you come to know it and then you formulate through reason what's truly going on, which you might be wondering, wait a minute, is it reason or is it an experience? We'll say more on that in a second with Kant. But that you can come across God, not by revelation, not by God's revealing himself to you, but by way of coming across him through reason. And this is, I said we'd be coming back to the United States, so now we're coming back to specifically Thomas Jefferson. There's a form of the Bible called the Jeffersonian Bible. In 1820, he wrote under the title, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And here, too, we have a really good example of someone who is very deist. The forefathers of the United States, writing the Constitution and so forth, were very influenced by the ideas of deism. And as you know, of course, also by Locke, which we mentioned already. And so while we can't dwell on this topic for long, because this isn't a history of the United States or philosophy singly of the United States, nor is anything that I believe Gaarder even touches on, it is something that is worth opening the door to and exploring a little bit of how the early formulation of a unifying philosophy for the United States started out perhaps in this sort of deist and Enlightenment fashion, Lockean even fashion. Okay, it's time now. As I said, we're going to spend the majority of this talking about Kant because we really can't overemphasize, overestimate how much of a contribution he made to philosophy. While Gaarder's book primarily focuses on the culmination point of Berkeley, and rightly so, for the plot, it makes sense to do so. For us, outside of the book, we want to perhaps consider this as one of our big turning points, which is exactly what Kant would want us to do. If you remember, the term Copernican revolution, used by Kant himself, of his own work, is used here. Okay, let's start first with his ethics and morality, although this risks us not understanding exactly where he's getting the ideas he is. So, he is, it's mentioned, of course, by Gaarder that he's influenced by Hume, but that's in the metaphysics primarily, and what he ends up doing is very different from Hume, especially in regards to morality. More on that shortly then. Who influences him then much in the ethics morality sphere? It's Rousseau. Jacques Rousseau, who I don't believe was mentioned, certainly not in the Kant chapter, I don't recall, mentioned once. And yet Kant was such an avid fan of Rousseau that the one picture apparently that he ever had hung in his study was a portrait of this man. Who is Jacques Rousseau? Jacques Rousseau, we aren't going to go into detail about. He's, in a sense, I would like to think of him as a romantic thinker, but he's definitely one of incredible passion. He also, taking on these values, has this almost sort of more Platonic way of thinking, in the sense that things are not as they should be. We ought to be living up to these values. The good is something that we are seeking to achieve, and so on and so forth. And let's just say it all leads up over time to, historically speaking, the French Revolution, which was a massive murder event. Terrible, terrible things happened during the French Revolution. Some could say, some good things happen, perhaps, but it's really hard to glean those singular moments. It was a lot of people stood behind Rousseau in that revolution, but the people who often stood for those ideals were themselves killed in the process, beheaded for the reasons that they were supposedly fighting for. It was a massive bloody thing, massive bloody war. However, let's get prior to this revolution, let's talk about what Rousseau shares with Kant, not directly, but through his writings. Now, Kant is just enamored with this man, and not wanting to take all aspects of him in, but wants to take enough time to enjoy him aesthetically, so that he can eventually, after being swept up in the passions of Rousseau, come to this more sort of Germanic standpoint of, okay, now we've got to look at this rationally and think about what sort of deductive consequences do we expect from this work, from this sort of philosophy. Rousseau is inspiring in Kant further confirmation that, yes, maybe there is a moral law. Very different from Hume, right? Hume is all about, in the end, there's this is-ought problem. And again, we're going to say what that corresponds to later on when it comes to the a priori, posteriori, a posteriori business. But anyway, this is-ought problem, there's a divide between them. That's Hume's guillotine. And we cannot derive an ought from an is. Therefore, it is not reason that fuels our morality, but our sentiment, our emotions. But we want to recognize that this falls within a specific sphere of ethics that is part of the normative ethic branch. So let's go back for a second. Do you remember those three major types of let's say, branches of ethics, right? And one of them is meta-ethics, not metaphysics, but meta-ethics. We can say discourse about how ethical principles can be made in the first place, that we are not going to get into during this course. But it's there. No, it's there. Applied ethics is just usually what we apply ethical principles and stratagems to, and that too we're mostly going to leave aside. We're mostly focusing on normative ethics, and normative ethics itself has another three branches or spheres within it. All right, there you have it. Normative ethics. Now, these are not meant to be exhaustive. We could say that there are others, perhaps, one could argue such, but we're going to focus on these because these are really the only ones we tend to give any real weight in philosophy. So, one of these is virtue ethics. Go back to Aristotle. Remember that? Virtue ethics, the idea that there are virtues in the world. Some people become sort of the harbingers of morality in the sense that they represent those virtues, and everybody's sort of influenced. Their circles of concentric circles of people around that individual who are influenced by that. What ends up being established as good, it has a lot to do with virtues. That's not Kant, obviously. Consequentialism is, think of the word consequences. Consequences are the results of some action or decision made. we're going to talk about Kant as a deontologist. Deontology. Think about deontology. The word ontology is in there, right? The study of, or metaphysics, right? Ontology as the study of what is. Deontology, the de as from, think of it as an ethics that derives from a metaphysics or from what exists. So his deontology is something that I'll describe briefly first, and then we'll see what is the ontology or metaphysics from which it comes. So in a nutshell, using the same words as Gaarder, duty, ethics, moral law is something that is absolute, at least as absolute as anything we can say about causality. So if we believe causality to be real, we ought to be certain that morality is also real. And unlike his counterpart, you could say, or at least his inspiration, Hume here, the man who supposedly woke him from this deep slumber of just constant metaphysical teachings and such. He was a teacher. He did a lot of professing over lots and lots of different subjects, but he really supposedly came alive when he read Hume, in addition to Rousseau before that. So moral law is not something we just sort of willy-nilly, in some sense, if that's too loose a word, forgive me, but something we just make up based on how we feel about things. It's something that we can arrive at by, in a sense, reason, but really something else he calls faith. We're going to see later on that this word comes up a lot. It's going to come up in regards to metaphysics itself also, this idea of faith in metaphysics. Now, before we talk about specifically the categorical imperative and something else called the hypothetical imperative, and give some examples so that it is really clear what is meant by this. What are the consequences of assuming these things to be true? Let's first talk for a moment about the metaphysics. So like Hume, Kant wants to look at metaphysics and try and investigate this question. Is a metaphysics actually possible of becoming a science? Unlike Hume, he goes about trying to figure this out not by skepticism, not by this Humean skepticism, but by asking a further question: what is a science? If we can discern what a science is, then maybe we can discern whether or not metaphysics can be one or ever become one. If up to this day, then, we've been mostly just squabbling and we've been wrestling with these different ideas of, is it monism and dualism? Is it a bunch of monads, or is it really just all qualities, bundles of qualities? We've been wrestling with these without like a pure systemic means of determining what is going to be true or not, as a science would. Let's define what a science is then. A science then as this systematic, integrated approach that, yes, may incorporate smaller little transformations over time, but overall is methodical and is capable of saying more or less true statements. I say more or less for a reason, but true statements about the world because of its systemization. And things, after undergoing a certain rigor, get included in that tomb of the sciences, and things that do not stand up to the test can be weighed out of it. Well, it sounds a little like Hume again, doesn't it? Wasn't that what he was all about? He was saying matters of fact and relations of ideas, and let's just cast out anything else that doesn't fall under those two criteria. But Kant says that's not good enough. All right, I'm going to throw some more big words at you. Fortunately, two of them you already know. We've talked about the a priori, a posteriori divide. We talked about that, and we saw how that really, in a way, is explaining that there's almost another word, as it were, each of them for Hume's matters of fact versus relations of ideas. But now we've got two more words to throw at you here, which is analytic versus synthetic. Now, examples are going to provide the best way to understand what's happening, but I'm still going to attempt to define them a little bit first, just so that we are on the right track. Analytic is where something can be explained by means of its own definition. And another way that Kant says this is that the predicate is within the subject. Do you remember our example last time of a bachelor is an unmarried man? Again, we don't have to investigate the world and statistically prove that to be the case. It's inherent to what it means to be a bachelor. Likewise, as it were, a triangle has 3 sides and 3 corners. So those are things that fall under the analytic, and specifically they're the analytic a priori. That's easy enough. Okay, so why? Because remember, you don't have to experience these things. They're a priori. You don't have to experience these things to know them true, and they're inherent to themselves. They're part of the definition of what it is to be that thing. Now, let's talk about synthetic. Synthetic means that you have to add things together. Don't think synthetic like synthetic polyester and stuff. It means something a little different. Synthetic in this case means that you have to add different, let's say, explanations or definitions. You have to add things together to come up with an explanation for something. In this case, we would say you're adding together the experiences or the empirical data or whatever in order to say something definitively, like whether or not swans are all white. And we look in the world, and after we've added many, many experiences and empirical data of many, many white swans, we eventually come across a black swan, and we know that's not true anymore. We couldn't have known that without experiencing it a posteriori, and it required us thinking synthetically about those experiences. We had to add them all up. So, what have we got so far? We have Hume's matters of fact and relations of ideas. So what are with these other 2 boxes? Is there something more going on here? Well, let's talk about the thing that cannot happen first. We cannot have anything in the way of, we can have an analytic a priori, relations of ideas, we can have a synthetic a posteriori. Those would be matters of fact. We cannot have an analytic a posteriori. Think about that. Why would that not be possible? So I have to experience something in order to accumulate that knowledge, in order to get that knowledge in the first place. But the knowledge was already somehow inherent to it to begin with, like through definition. It makes no sense. There would be no requirement for me to experience it if it were analytic in the first place. So this is nonsense. But where Kant finds the basis, the foundation for science itself to take place, science in the way that he's talking about it, not necessarily science we usually say it, but a systematic, rigorous, methodical way of talking about the world, is up here. And this is famously known as the synthetic a priori. Okay, how does this work? Well, we said synthetic is like adding, so maybe we should just think about adding. Let's think about math for a second. A triangle, by definition, has 3 sides. It's a polygon of 3 sides and 3 corners, right? But could we know right off the bat, by definition, that the vertices or corners of the triangle will add up to 180 degrees? We sort of assumed that would happen before. But as it were, that's not really inherent to the definition of a triangle, is it? It's something we have to sort of poke around with and synthetically develop. We don't have to develop it by way of experience, though. We're still using reason to do that. We reason out that here's one basic way of figuring that out. If we know that the 4 corners of a square, for instance, are each a right angle in order for it to be a square, and I cut that square in half, then that means that I have cut 2 of the corners in half. They were both 90, now they're 45. 45 plus 45 is 90, plus the last right angle down here, which is 90, and I get 180. Now that's not a proof, but we can start to play around with further reasoning and find that by way of proof, we will discover this to be inherently true to being a triangle. But we had to do some work for that. That wasn't inherent to the definition of a triangle, it seems at first. Addition in general doesn't seem to resemble this. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is so readily available to us that we just take for granted that must be analytic a priori. But actually, if you think about it, there's no definition of addition that says that 2 plus 2 will equal 4. And if you take a much larger example, 387 plus 5,262, you would actually have to think through that, wouldn't you? You'd have to really go through some sort of methodical practice of, through reason, discovering what the answer must necessarily be. But it's not inherent to addition itself, it's your utilizing addition to get there. And so here we have synthetic process to a priori reasoning, and this is a huge, monumental discovery, because it's what Hume and both the rationalists to some extent and the pure empiricists had overlooked. And keep in mind, this is not a middle ground. This is something else. There could have ended up being an analytic a posteriori, by the way. It just clearly, by way of defining these terms, couldn't be the case. But it was by way of creating the sort of fourfold measure, which comes up a lot in philosophy, by the way, these fourfold structures, that we discover there was a whole category of something we didn't even understand to exist up to this point. And so what is a science? A science utilizes this. Have you noticed science does incorporate a lot of mathematical reasoning, and it relies a lot on our experience and an a posteriori incorporation of observables in the world. Now, he's not saying this is all science does, but it must have some part of this, something of the synthetic a priori, to work. In that, we recognize then that there's actually a dichotomy here as well, one of the most important dichotomies that has ever been created in philosophy. Again, kind of raising his status a little bit here. We have the Ding an sich, das Ding an sich. We've finally come to that. We've come to recognizing that there is a thing in itself. After all, we said before, and Kant would, I think, rightly agree with us, that if there is a bundle of qualities, there must be a thing around which qualities bundle. We cannot, says Kant, have appearances without something generating or the origin of those appearances. That said, we also have to recognize, Gaarder uses this analogy of the glasses. I don't like it a little bit for certain reasons. It's a good, it's a sort of a good way of introducing the idea, but its faults are very obvious very quickly. The whole point to having, rose-colored lenses is that you can take them off. And we would assume, well, even if it's really difficult to do so, that it's not impossible. Maybe there is some perspective in the world, perhaps it's God's perspective of being able to see things as they truly, really are in themselves, Ding an sich, without just going by way of appearances. Maybe there is such a perspective in the world. Regardless of thoughts about God being able to do so, let's just talk about human beings. No. The answer is no. There is no taking off of the glasses. There's no perspective that science or otherwise could come to that actually gives us direct knowledge, direct experience of the things in themselves. Our experience is always going to be catering to what our, as it were, lenses supposedly are, what our perceptive, our means of cognition are. So again, using the example Gaarder brought up, the idea of time and space as being really an inherent cognitive function. I don't agree with this, by the way, but a cognitive function that then is in some sense projected onto the world so that we can make sense of it. Aha. Well, that is a priori in some sense, in that it's derived from a reasoning of the world prior to experience. And because it's prior to experience, it is reason-based. At the same time, it, as it were, conforms experience of the objects to reason. So, and if you're not getting this, go listen to that a couple of times over. This is a hard concept to get. But here is the essence of what he's calling the Copernican revolution, is instead of us trying to conform and understand the things that will conform our knowledge to them, it is really more that our reason and our cognitive apparatuses, our functions of cognition, are the things to which objects themselves conform in some way for us. Those are phenomena. However, there also exists, and this is the critical point that I would take away with, things in the world that he calls noumena, because the only real axis you could imagine there being is not axis at all, really, but thinking about them, reasoning about them. This will be taken up later on by phenomenologists as well. And these noumena, These things are never directly accessible. They cannot be known to us by way of knowledge or the sciences. Now, what does this say about metaphysics? This whole project was for the sake of determining whether or not metaphysics was going to be a science and therefore a viable study. It turns out that metaphysics can't do what its aim was, which is to, on the one hand, it's supposed to be metaphysical. Physical is what we can glean through certain physical sciences by way of experience, as well as reasoning about those experiences, mathematically deducing, as Newton and others did, what is going on in the physical world. So metaphysics is supposed to be above that. It's supposed to be beyond that. It's supposed to be, as it were, talking about the things in themselves, the noumena. But if we can't directly access those things, then we don't really have a way of creating such a science of the things themselves. In other words, a metaphysics in this sense is in a way, bizarrely, not possible. That's bad news. It's really bad news. And for that very same reason, ever since, many philosophers, not all, they have, in the way that Kant has described it, let go of metaphysics as a possible venue for rigorous philosophy. Metaphysics is even, to some, a bad word. So do we throw it all out? Do we just throw it out? Is philosophy for naught? Well, no. He's saying maybe as far as metaphysics pertains to what we can call speculative reasoning about things in themselves, we have no hope. However, practical reasoning is still on the table. That is, what we can do about things that we put our faith into. That is, though reason cannot deduce for us the existence of an immortal soul, the existence of a God, freedom, free will. If we have faith that those things are there, ultimately what we're doing then is we're understanding our cognition. We're understanding human cognition. And by understanding these first principles that Kant has developed of human cognition, says Kant, we can understand that morality and free will and God, having faith in those things, we understand how morality does play a role in the world, and it is, in a way, an absolute law. And the practical reasoning that we can use to flesh out then what to do, what sort of ethics to live, is still a very viable and important aspect of philosophy. And perhaps for most people even today, that is the most important aspect of philosophy, is what does it tell us we should do in the world. I'm not in this camp that that's all that philosophy is really for, but it is a pretty prominent perspective in philosophy today. And now we can talk about the categorical imperative, but let's contrast that to what he calls the hypothetical imperative. I'm not going to go into too much length here because Gaarder mentions this already in the book, but he doesn't mention the hypothetical imperative, so let me dwell on that for a second. Hypothetical imperative. Let's say that I am trying to decide whether or not to pet my cat today. Now, the hypothetical imperative here is that, well, I can hypothesize what the consequences of that would be. Would that do any good in the world and so forth? And as it were, I can't arrive at some concrete way of reason that this is a good or a bad thing to do. Ultimately, and I don't want to push that consequences are the way we understand this to be true, because that would make it a consequentialist ethics, but just that we can recognize easily that there's no way of reason that tells me, yes, petting my cat right now is the morally right thing to do. But let's contrast that to a categorical imperative, which, as Gaarder mentions, requires this maxim that we take to the bank and we take to the farthest end we take it to its logical end, and we decide, therefore, whether or not we're dealing with a categorical imperative based on that logical end. So imagine something like lying. Now, that lying may seem, especially in the case of a white lie and so forth, may seem mostly inconsequential, but let's take it to its logical end. If I take as a maxim whether or not to pet my cat, nothing good or bad is immediately pointed out. Sure, if everybody pets their cats, cats will be a little bit happier, but nothing clearly morally develops from that. But lying, if I were to take as a maxim that everyone should lie, and we take that again to the farthest extent, lying is all that people do. in order to, in any sort of discourse or dialogue, that's all people will do is lie. I take it to that end, and what happens? Now, people tend to posit it as, well, what happens is you have a breakdown in society and bad things happen. You can quickly figure out whether it's moral. And that could be one way of thinking about it. But here's, to me, the more accurate way of viewing what he's saying. He's saying we arrive at a contradiction. And it is a true contradiction in this sense, that if everybody were lying, we would not know what lying was anymore. There wouldn't be the term lying would have no significance anymore. Lying would no longer be a thing, as it were. Because if everybody were lying, that's the only manner of discourse there was. It wouldn't be lying versus truth-telling anymore. Everything every form of discourse is now lying. And so, what is lying? It's just discourse. And here we have the contradiction. Lying no longer, as it were, exists in that form. If everybody pets their cats, once a day, if that were what my maxim, it doesn't nullify the fact that petting itself is an act, that there's petting versus non-petting. Like if everybody pets their cat, that's still a form of petting. But if everybody lies and only lies all the time, there's no significance or sense in which lying doesn't take place, and therefore that is discourse. And so we arrive at lying and not lying at the same time. Here's our contradiction. So this is a categorical imperative. Now, what does this look like in the real world? Taking an example like this helps us understand just what a deontological ethics might look like, at least in a Kantian way, so a Kantian ethic. So imagine, it's sometimes called the refugee example. Imagine that somebody is coming to your house during some, war-stricken time. You know that there are this particular group of people, and you don't agree with the politics that is ostracized them, and they're collecting these people, and they are likely killing these people. You can imagine certain points of history where this would have been true. And the refugee comes to your house and asks for sanctuary, asks for a place to hide, because there are soldiers chasing them right now. You let them into your house. You hide them up in your attic, perhaps. Kind of Anne Frank style, right? And then the soldiers come. They come up to your door. They have good reason, they think, to believe that you are holding a refugee, so they ask you point blank, are you holding a refugee? Now remember what we just said about lying. Categorical imperative says, thou shalt not lie, really. You should not lie, but it's not based just on mere, authoritarianism by God. It's the, as it were, authoritarian of reason, saying that we should not lie because it's our categorical imperative. The maxim has demonstrated that, and we come to a contradiction if we carry that maxim forward. So, categorical imperative, no lying. I will say, yes, I am holding a refugee. Perhaps this is what I will do. Now, there's a lot of pushback on that. Oh, well, this is clear evidence that this is the wrong thing to do. It seems so true to us that this would be the wrong thing to do. We don't agree with the politics that's capturing and killing. And by the way, another categorical imperative says, do not kill. If everybody killed, there'd be nothing else to kill. There'd be nothing else doing the killing. Killing then is contradicting itself. Not to kill, is now a categorical imperative. So what do you do here? Well, there are alternate solutions. Maybe you don't lie, but you still barricade the soldiers from coming in. Or maybe you try and find a way to detain them or not kill them, but to hold your ground against them. You can't lie, right? So you simultaneously say it in a loud voice, yes, there's a refugee here, and that gives the refugee a chance to escape, right? Maybe if you said it loud enough, they can hear you. So it's not like there's only one thing you should do, but it's very clear what you shouldn't do. What do you think? Does Kantian ethics make sense? A lot of us would probably say no. The majority of us probably think in a more consequentialist way. I really don't want them to die, but here's the pushback against that. What if, by trying to lie, you tell the guards, the soldiers, that, no, you're not holding a refugee, and so they walk away. But unbeknownst to you, because you can't know everything, unbeknownst to you, the refugee has already tried to make an escape. And while they've escaped from your house, you've actually given the soldiers a reason to leave your house because you told them you don't have one. And now they spot the refugee, and now they got him. And you contributed to that. Well, you can say, oh, that seems so unlikely, but is it not possible? Is it not even somewhat likely? that that could happen? You don't know everything, but you can, so a posteriori, there's no sense in which you can make an argument here. There's nothing, you can't experience something you haven't experienced yet. But a priori, by way of reason, you can deduce what to do in that circumstance. It's not to lie, right? It's to tell the truth, perhaps even, or say nothing even. No one said you couldn't just shut your mouth, right? But by supposing that you know the right answer based on a consequentialist approach based on what you think is going to happen in the future is a little fortune telling, isn't it? So hopefully you can see there is an argument to be made for both sides here. And so again, we define duty ethics as the position that the moral of actions is inherently right or wrong based on principles, not on their consequences. And the principles specifically of Kantian duty ethics or Kantian ethics is the principle of the maxim and the categorical imperative. And just before we wrap up, let's talk for a quick moment on what's missing here in Kant's analysis, perhaps. We want to be careful of our assumptions, don't we? If Ding an sich, and I agree, das Ding an sich may be the most important concept, the thing in itself, the most important concept to have finally gotten a hold of, that there's a thing in itself. And we can't have appearances or phenomena without these things that we can call noumena, that are only really noumena because we can reason about them or think about them, but we can't get at them. We can't know them directly in some sense. But is this only a human phenomenon? This notion of having inaccessibility to the things in themselves is called finitude. And this is a great word because it's precisely meant to say we can't have infinite knowledge. I mean, precisely why Kant says we can't know if the universe is infinite or not is because we ourselves are only a small part of that universe. And so infinity would not be part of our repertoire of relational, experiential, or even reasonable attainments. But again, is finitude only a human thing? Or is it possible that all things have some form of finitude? I would say so, don't you think? It's not like the Daruma here, or my mouse, or my pencil, or my mic can somehow expand in its basis of experience or knowledge. You might go, Kelsey, come on, those things don't experience anything. Well, animals do, don't they? I would reason they do, and plants also have some sort of experience. They certainly respond to things. It sounds like we need to revisit the idea of what experience is. Maybe there is some manner in which inanimate objects even can experience the world, but not in any way that we are familiar with, not in any sense. I'm not trying to posit that they have minds like we do, but maybe there's still room for experience without a mind. And that's something maybe we'll tease out at another time. But remember that as an assumption. We've assumed in this anthropocentric world, the so-called Copernican revolution, that the things around us actually in some way conform to the mind of the human being. This sounds anti-Copernican to me. Wasn't the whole point of Copernicanism in every version of it? And we'll see more versions of it later on. One of the biggest, most recent developments in Darwin is where we realize the human being is not the center of that structure, the center of the system, where we as human beings revolve around the sun, not the other way around. And likewise, objects do not inherently revolve around us, do they? Don't we revolve around each other in lots of different ways? I think this is an important thing to continue to entertain as you move forward. And it will also help us buffer a little bit against some of the, both the good and the bad that's going to come with German idealism, which we'll talk about next time.